August 2nd, 1990, a date that will forever be engraved in the hearts and minds of every Kuwaiti, a date when the whole world woke up to the tragedy of Iraqi regime forces brutally invading Kuwait. 31 years later, we once again reflect on that infamous day and the events that unfolded following that day. Following the initial invasion, the United States led efforts to form a multinational coalition to work with the United Nations Security Council to help liberate Kuwait. Coalition forces began mobilizing in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in response to the invasion. By invading Kuwait, Iraq gained control of 20% of the world's oil reserves and, for the first time, a substantial coastline on the Arabian Gulf. That same day, the United Nations Security Council unanimously denounced the invasion and demanded Iraq's immediate withdrawal from Kuwait. On August the 6th, the Security Council imposed a worldwide ban on trade with Iraq. The multinational force included 38 other countries from around the world, including Argentina, Australia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Morocco, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Qatar, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United Arab Emirates. On August 9th, Operation Desert Shield began as U.S. forces raced to the Arabian Gulf. Iraqi forces, meanwhile, built up their occupying army in Kuwait to about 300,000 troops. On November the 29th, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution authorizing the use of force against Iraq if it failed to withdraw by January the 15th of the year 1991. Some 700,000 Allied troops gathered in the Middle East to enforce the deadline. The Iraqi regime's aggression continued as they refused to remove their forces from the state of Kuwait. On January the 17th, 1991, U.S. and coalition forces began an air campaign to protect the Arabian Peninsula and secure Kuwait's sovereignty. Within 24 hours, coalition forces controlled the airspace over Kuwait. Hours after the air campaign began, former United States President George H.W. Bush gave a speech describing the U.S.-led coalition's efforts to liberate Kuwait. In that speech, he said, quote, "The legitimate government of Kuwait will be restored to its rightful place, and Kuwait will once again be free. Iraq will eventually comply with all relevant United Nations resolutions, and then, when peace is restored, it is our hope that Iraq will live as a peaceful and cooperative member of the family of nations, thus enhancing the security and stability of the Gulf." The United Kingdom's Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, also had a significant role in building the strong international consensus over the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. In August of 1990, Prime Minister Thatcher and her cabinet began discussions on the deployment of British troops to Kuwait in order to create a barrier for any further Iraqi aggression. The clear support of the United Nations Security Council and the fact that Iraq had clearly violated international agreements helped to convince many MPs to support the military operation.
Margaret Thatcher called for the next step, that next step being further consideration by the Security Council of possible measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is the use of military and non-military action to restore international peace and security, and to act against any who should breach that peace or act aggressively. She famously said that dictators do not surrender, they have to be well and truly defeated. The fundamental question was this: whether the nations of the world had the collective will to effectively see that the Security Council resolution upheld, and whether they had the collective will to effectively act in line with the Security Council decision to further agreed sanctions to ensure that Iraq withdrew and that the legitimate government was restored to Kuwait. This required a collective and effective will of all the UN nations, first the Security Council and then the support of all other nations. So basically, she lobbied the United Nations. Prior John Major taking the role as a Prime Minister, the UK Cabinet had taken the decision that war might be necessary. However, none of the real arrangement for it had yet been made, so that was on his plate the moment he arrived. The first thing to do was, of course, to get an idea of the logistics and scale, not just the military commanders, but how many soldiers, type of equipment, positioning, action planning. Then came what John Major called the ancillary matters, medical teams, post services back home, and also the political logistics, of course, how to prepare public, how to keep Parliament on side, spiritual support from religious organizations. He was seeking the maximum amount of support for the troops. Despite the logistics, John Major made a real effort to remember the humanity of this, and also particularly the young members, and had to keep them and their families motivated as well as safe amongst the fear that the Iraqis may potentially plan to use biological or chemical weapons. I believe the humanity really helped. And also on an international level, Sir John Major was lobbying other nations for continued political support to support Kuwait and support Kuwait case.
On the 27th of September of 1990, His Highness the late Emir, Sheikh Jabir al-Ahmed al-Jabir al-Sabah, delivered a historic speech before over 60 state presidents, 90 government leaders, ministers, and ambassadors during the 45th session of the United Nations General Assembly. All attendees stood up and applauded in tribute, respect, and support of His Highness and the just cause of Kuwait. On the 22nd of December of the same year, His Highness also participated in the 11th GCC Summit, which was held in Doha under the slogan of Liberation and Change. The summit confirmed the GCC country's stance in support of Kuwait. The late Emir also went on a number of official visits around the world, which included the Security Council's permanent members, the United States, France, Britain, and China, to mobilize support for the liberation of Kuwait. On January the 16th of the year 1991, Operation Desert Storm, the massive US-led offensive against Iraq, began as the first fighter aircraft was launched from Saudi Arabia and off US and British aircraft carriers in the Arabian Gulf. Throughout that evening, aircrafts from the US-led military coalition struck targets in and around Baghdad, as the world watched the events transpire on television footage transmitted live from Iraq. Operation Desert Storm was conducted by an international coalition under the supreme command of U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf During the next 6 weeks, the Allied forces engaged in an intensive aerial campaign against Iraq's military and civil infrastructure and encountered little effective resistance from the Iraqi Air Force or air defenses. Iraqi ground forces were helpless during this stage of the war, and Iraq's only significant retaliatory measure was the launching of Scud missile attacks against Saudi Arabia. On February the 24th, a massive coalition ground offensive began, and Iraq's outdated and poorly supplied armed forces were rapidly overwhelmed. By the end of the day, the Iraqi army had effectively folded. 10,000 of its troops were held as prisoners, and a U.S. airbase had been established deep inside Iraq. After a month of airstrikes, British troops began land operations known as Operation Granby, started on the 24th of February. In its largest single deployment since the Second World War, the British Army deployed the 1st Armored Division from its garrisons in Germany under the command of Major General Sir Rupert Smith. The division's 2 fighting brigades, the 7th and the 4th Armored Brigades, were equipped with Challenger 1 main battle tanks and Warrior infantry fighting vehicles that packed a potent punch and were supported by some of the latest artillery systems, helicopters, and combat engineer equipment. The whole force was sustained by an enormous logistic equipment support and medical network drawn from all over the army. The Allied air offensive, which commenced on the 16th of January 1991, delivered crushing blows to the Iraqi command and control systems, infrastructure, and armed forces. The ground offensive gave a helping hand to the airstrikes as the 1st Armored Division was placed under the command of the U.S. 7th Corps. From the launch of Operation Desert Sabre, the ground phase of the war, on the 24th of February 1991, the British force would advance 180 miles in 66 hours, destroying the equivalent of 3 Iraqi armored divisions and captured over 7,000 prisoners. Modern weapon systems, integrated forces, and tactics developed to fight the Soviets in the Cold War proved unbeatable even to the Iraqi forces. After less than 4 days, Kuwait was liberated, and the majority of Iraq's armed forces had either surrendered, retreated to Iraq, or had been destroyed.
Margaret Thatcher, representing the UK, was instrumental in convincing other nations to stand with us. She was the first leader to stand up and say Saddam's attack on Kuwait was wrong, as she sent her finest troops to help us. She said, and I quote, "When Saddam marched into Kuwait, he has treated those people brutally, and so far they had no one to fight back for them. Now they know that we're fighting back in no uncertain way. Those taking hostages know that we're fighting back on their behalf." What more could be said after those brave words? Baroness Thatcher was the first global leader to publicly stand up against what Saddam Hussein was doing. And together with the US President Bush, they called a press conference and they lobbied the United Nations. This resulted in sanctions against Iraq. This made all the difference and was a huge help to us. Additionally, there was a huge sacrifice made by the armed force of Great Britain. Together, the Kuwaiti, British and other allied cleared over 1.6 million mines. But in doing so, 290 allied soldiers, including 47 British soldiers, were killed in the conflict. We really are thankful for the British government for their aid and sacrifice made by its people during this difficult time. And we honor those and the families of those who lost their lives during the conflict. The British forces are also still to this day using DNA identification to help to identify who were kidnapped or those sad souls were fell to landmines.
Among the fleet of warplanes heavily relied upon by coalition forces was the F-117, which inflicted damage on strategic targets in the Iraqi capital and overwhelmed the Iraqi army. The first day of the military operation lasted 240 minutes, where some 400 warplanes executed 1,200 strikes that destroyed half of the Iraqi arsenal. The aerial barrage was mostly targeted on biological, atomic, and chemical weapons that were stored in the northern Iraqi cities of Mosul, Erbil, and Al-Kufa, in addition to the southern cities of Baghdad and Basra. Moreover, more than 100 U.S. naval ships joined the war, along with 1,800 warplanes and 1,700 helicopters that assisted the Kuwaiti Air Force as it focused on locations inside Kuwait in efforts to protect valuable possessions. By the end of the war, on February the 27th, 1991, coalition forces, which comprised a total of 32 nations, had destroyed 88,500 tons of supplies, while coalition contributions to liberate Kuwait amounted to $53 billion US. On February the 26th of 1991, coalition forces declared victory, heralding their success in the goal to liberate Kuwait. The then United States President George H.W. Bush declared a suspension of Gulf War hostilities just 100 hours after the ground offensive began. At the same time, he confronted Iraq with a series of demands which reflected the overwhelming Allied victory achieved since Operation Desert Storm was launched in the air 6 weeks prior. There was no immediate reaction from Baghdad, but sources at the United Nations indicated that the Security Council might reconvene to hear a possible Iraqi response. As Allied forces reported sweeping victories and deep intrusion into Iraq, President Bush went on television to famously declare that Kuwait is liberated and Iraq's army has been defeated. He said that a ceasefire was dependent on Iraqi agreement not to attack coalition forces nor continue its Scud missile assaults. If Iraq failed to comply, then the war would resume. The president ordered all prisoners of war had to be released along with any Kuwaitis taken by Iraqi troops as they fled Kuwait. In his televised address from the Oval Office, President Bush also announced that then U.S. Secretary of State James Baker would travel to the Middle East the following week to begin consultations on a post-war settlement. In a dramatic conclusion to a day of high political drama and continued military confrontation, which culminated in U.S. successes on the battlefield and at the United Nations, President Bush declared that Kuwait, invaded by Iraqi forces on August the 2nd, was liberated, and that Iraqi troops had been defeated, and that the Allies' objectives had been met. In his famous speech, he said, quote, "Our military objectives are met. Kuwait is once more in the hands of the Kuwaitis, in control of their own destiny. We share in their joy, a joy tempered only by our compassion for their ordeal."
Freedom and respect for human rights find a home among all nations. The Gulf War put this new world to its first test. And my fellow Americans, we passed that test. For the sake of our principles, for the sake of the Kuwaiti people, we stood our ground. because the world would not look the other way. Ambassador El Saba, tonight, Kuwait is free. Where is it? We're very happy about that.
Kuwaitis proudly remember the great role played by the late Emir, Sheikh Jabir al-Ahmed al-Jabir al-Sabah, to restore Kuwait's sovereignty. During the first few weeks of the invasion, the late Emir issued a number of Emiri orders and decrees for managing the internal affairs of the country. The most important ones were the temporary meeting of the government in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, ministers continuing to perform their duties and arranging the financial and living circumstances of Kuwaiti families abroad. On the international level, the late Emir exerted several efforts, including the mobilization of international support, attending conferences, and participating in international activities, as well as sending Kuwaiti delegations to different countries to explain the situation and obtain support to help liberate Kuwait. The efforts of the late Emir commenced with the participation in the Emergency Arab Summit Conference, which was held in Cairo on the 10th of August 1990, where the Arab leaders stood behind Kuwait and called for ending the occupation and restoring legitimacy. At the International Islamic Conference, which was held in Mecca on the 10th of September 1990, the late Emir again urged the Islamic world to denounce the horrific actions of the Iraqi regime. At the same time, the late Father Emir, Sheikh Saad al-Abdullah Salim al-Sabah, delivered a memorable address to the nation, where he commended the Kuwaiti people for their show of unity in the face of Iraqi aggression. His Highness the late Emir, Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed al-Jabir al-Sabah, who was the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs during the invasion, played a pivotal role in mobilizing official Arab support and the absolute support of the international community to liberate Kuwait from the Iraqi invasion. Sheikh Sabah's efforts were forcefully translated on the ground, as he was able to obtain the condemnation of the leaders of the international community for the crime of the former Iraqi regime against the state of Kuwait. The United Nations Security Council quickly and successfully issued a series of decisive decisions, starting with Resolution 660, which demanded the Iraqi regime forces to withdraw immediately from Kuwait, followed by a package of other equally important decisions issued by the Council under Chapter 7, which stipulates the use of force to ensure the implementation of decisions. The efforts of the late Emir, Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed, succeeded in mobilizing Arab and international diplomatic support in the interest of supporting and backing Kuwaiti legitimacy, thanks to his vast diplomatic experience over many years that began from the moment he took over the Foreign Ministry portfolio in the year 1963, and his success in documenting and strengthening the country's relations with the United Nations and all its institutions and its member states. After the liberation of the state of Kuwait, the late Emir, Sheikh Jabir al-Ahmed, delivered a speech on the occasion of the last 10 days of the holy month of Ramadan, in which he said, quote, Praise be to Allah, who gathered us again on our land, reunified us, and granted us victory over the oppressors. May Allah grant mercy to our martyrs, freedom to our prisoners of war, and health and well-being to our injured ones. In that speech, the late Emir assured that the adversity of Kuwait revealed the nobility of all the leaders and peoples of the GCC countries, who proved that brotherhood is not just mere words, but a profound belief that is materialized in harsh times. The late Emir also praised the great role played by the Arab and Islamic countries in the liberation of the state of Kuwait, as well as the international community that participated in the Allied forces' operations, who mobilize all their powers and capabilities to fight for the just liberation of Kuwait.
The attack on Kuwait was pivotal for me. When I think back about the attack, I can never take the safety and the security for myself and my family for granted. In just one day, everything changed and everything we knew was turned on its head. My father met the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, in Kuwait back in 1991. It was an official liberation ceremony held by the Royal Ordnance, and my father had been invited to represent Kuwait Ministry of Defence and also in his capacity as a liaison to the British Army. During the conflict, he held the role of a Major General and worked with the British Army to clear more than 500 minefields across the land of Kuwait. During introductions, Margaret Thatcher spoke of how his work in the minefields helped the British troops with general protection, helped them to find safe accommodation, helped them to provide a safe transport. She noted that without the work done by the troops, my father, his colleagues, and the Royal Ordnance and the British Army, at that point under Sergeant Major, would, rather than having safe passage across the land, have had to risk unsafe passage through the islands surrounding Kuwait. As she presented my father with the Badge of Honor, she thanked him for his role helping the British troops, particularly as a liaison officer between the British and the Kuwaiti troops, and in clearing the land of Kuwait of mines and making it safe again. Margaret Thatcher was instrumental in helping our country at its greatest hour of need. Margaret Thatcher was greatly known for her strength of character and her courage and her strong belief in the rule of law. She had a very strong set of principles.
After the end of the invasion, the United Nations Security Council established Resolution 687 of the year 1991, which set up a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, along the borders between Iraq and Kuwait, to be monitored by a United Nations Observer Unit, and requested the Secretary General to submit a plan for the unit's immediate deployment. The Secretary General reported back on the 5th of April 1991 and on the 9th by its Resolution 689 of the year 1991. The Security Council, acting under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, established the United Nations Iraq-Kuwait Observation Mission, or UNIKOM, with the strength of 300 military observers. It was not just the Allied forces who played a part in helping liberate Kuwait. Kuwaiti citizens themselves also played a considerable role in the resistance and liberation. The Kuwaiti people's confrontation of the enemy showed the solidarity of the citizens who played their part to defend their country against the oppressors. The 26th of February is an important day for all Kuwaitis who annually celebrate and reflect on this day that will always remain in memory. It is difficult to find words that do justice to the Kuwaiti Resistance of 1990 to 1991, the remaining untold story of a great international crisis. Men and women, youth and the elderly, bravely risked their lives in an effort to thwart the occupation of Iraqi forces. In the end, the resistance's casualty, or hostages number, was massive. Its deeds were all remarkable for having been carried out by ordinary people, and it provided valuable services to the coalition forces. The resistance had four main areas of activity. The first, civil disobedience, which initially included public demonstrations and the boycott of most work, but then narrowed in scope to just the latter. The second, maintaining morale through the provision of essential services and other forms of support. Thirdly, preventing destruction in the oil fields, and finally, military operations, both attacking Iraqi troops and gathering intelligence for the Allies. The Kuwaiti Resistance never had a sole chief or a central command. Indeed, it had almost no formal organizational structure. Key figures emerged, and the resistance became more organized and interconnected with time, but it always remained an essentially grassroots movement. For its part, the resistance looked after the many Westerners hiding from the Iraqi forces, supplying them with food and basic needs. Kuwaiti sheltered Americans, Britons, French, and Germans in safe houses and in their own homes, at a great risk to the Kuwaitis and their families. Perhaps the resistance's most widespread aid to Westerners came in the form of forged driver's license identifying them as safe nationalities, such as Australian, Danish, Irish, New Zealander, and Canadian, and the alteration of car registration books so that vehicles could be used without confiscation. Resistance attacks on Iraqis made a significant difference. They kept the occupying forces off balance, maintained the honor of the country, provided real leverage to the coalition forces, and reduced the environmental damage that the invasion tried to wreak on the region. The resistance helped the coalition forces by providing important information on the morale and combat effectiveness of Iraqi troops and by pinpointing targets. In a glowing letter of tribute to the Kuwaiti Resistance dated March the 8th of 1991, Lieutenant General Charles A. Horner of the U.S. Air Force noted the ingenious and innovative methods for communicating vital intelligence about enemy dispositions and intentions in the Kuwaiti theater of operations. He also declared American gratitude for pinpointing locations of deployed enemy forces, ammunition depots, and chemical and biological ordnance storage areas. It is not at all inconceivable that the struggle to liberate Kuwait might have proven much more costly to both the coalition forces and the people of Kuwait if they had not received precise and timely information about these facilities from the brave soldiers of the Kuwaiti Resistance. The number of Iraqis killed or wounded by resistance attacks probably never exceeded 1,000, but conveyed the clear message that the invaders were unwelcome. In all, the Kuwaitis killed or wounded many more Iraqis than they lost in the resistance. More importantly, the military effort may have tied down some 30,000 Iraqi troops, or more than 10% of their army in Kuwait. The resistance conveyed their daily accounts of life under occupation, the atrocities, and the courage the ordinary Kuwaitis, which were critical in keeping Western public opinion focused on the issue of human rights. The environmental damage from the Iraqi invasion was devastating, which also included damage to the oil industry. Iraqi forces destroyed more than 700 oil wells in Kuwait, spilling 60 million barrels of oil. Over 10 million cubic meters of soil, as well as the entire freshwater reserve, remained contaminated for many years following the liberation. 10 million barrels of oil were released into the Gulf, affecting coastline along 1,500 kilometers. During the 9 months that the oil wells burned, average air temperatures fell by 10 degrees Celsius as a result of reduced light from the sun. The cost of environmental damage was estimated at around $40 billion. Other environmental effects of the invasion include the destruction of sewage treatment plants, resulting in the discharge of over 50,000 cubic meters of raw sewage every day into the bay. Recently, the Kuwait Oil Company, or KOC, signed 3 contracts with international companies to treat soil that was contaminated as a result of the brutal invasion 31 years ago. The Kuwait Environmental Rehabilitation Program, or KERP, is considered the largest environmental rehabilitation project in the world and will focus on repairing and rehabilitating approximately 13 million cubic meters of soil that was contaminated after the Iraqi regime forces burned more than 700 oil wells. After the return of the late Emir Sheikh Jabir al-Ahmed al-Jabir al-Sabah to Kuwait on the 14th of March 1991, he undertook many official visits, during which he participated in numerous regional and international conferences. The goal of these visits was to thank the United Nations and its member states, in addition to the countries that joined the Allied forces' operations. The Kuwaiti leadership set and executed an integrated plan for the reconstruction of the state of Kuwait, which suffered considerable damage during the war, with almost all basic organizations not functioning and major infrastructure destroyed. The reconstruction plan was successfully executed with a total cost of nearly $70 billion, and its completion was celebrated, along with putting out the last of the oil wells that were set on fire by the Iraqis' forces before they were defeated. The state of Kuwait submitted a proposal to the United Nations General Assembly to declare the 6th of November as an international day for preventing the use of the environment in military conflicts. The proposal, which was approved in 2001, assures that the environmental damage incurred at the time of armed disputes leads to long-term destruction of the ecosystems and natural resources even after the dispute is over. Despite the devastation of the Kuwaiti economy during the invasion and occupation, the post-war recovery happened at a fast pace after the government gave the reconstruction and recovery of basic services a high priority. The oil industry, which was badly damaged, was also one of the top priorities in terms of reconstruction. 19 new wells were drilled to replace those damaged by the occupation, and by June 1992, oil production was back to nearly 1 million barrels per day. After many years, Kuwait and Iraq opened a new page in the history of bilateral relations on the basis of consolidating the principle of good neighborliness and common interests, with the aim of closing the problems of the past by adopting coordination and consultation between the leadership of the two sides. On more than one occasion, Kuwait donated funds to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to support its operations in assisting Iraqi refugees in order to alleviate their suffering and secure their needs of food, shelter, health, and education. The late Emir Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed crowned the steps of rapprochement with Iraq in the work of the Arab Summit, which was held in Baghdad in 2012, and it was the first visit of its kind since Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. In 2014, Kuwait hosted a conference of donor countries for the reconstruction of Iraq, and the pledges of the countries participating in the conference amounted to $30 billion in the form of loans, credit facilities, and investments made to Iraq in order to rebuild what the war destroyed. On February the 12th, 2019, another three-day Kuwait International Conference for the Reconstruction of Iraq kicked off, aimed at distributing contributions that will help rebuild Iraq's war-torn country. The conference, which was held under the auspices of His Highness the late Emir Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed al-Jabr al-Sabah, brought together a number of economically powerful countries as well as regional and international organizations that focused on procuring the needed contributions to rebuild Iraq after many years of conflict. The conference also touched on several developments and vital aspects pertaining to Iraq, including the participation of the private sector in the reconstruction process. The World Bank, as a major contributor to the event, provided the required investment guarantees for private companies and institutions to participate in the development of Iraq, with Kuwait continuing its humanitarian path and sending humanitarian supplies to the Iraqi people in war-torn areas. The Kuwaiti-Iraqi relations carried on to flourish towards developing bilateral relations, respecting the sovereignty of both nations and lending a helping hand to one another. Thanks to the wise leadership of the late Emir Sheikh Jabr al-Ahmed al-Jabr al-Sabah, the late Father Emir Sheikh Saad al-Abdullah al-Salim al-Sabah, and the late Emir Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed al-Sabah, and with the assistance of the Kuwaiti people, Kuwait was able to gain support of the international community and to achieve liberation. The date of August 2nd, 1990, remains a day when Kuwaitis reflect on the brutal invasion of their beloved country and remember the resilience of the Kuwaiti people in overcoming that tragedy 31 years later.